For the sake of yachts and mistresses, they armed the Soviet fleet but bankrupt the Soviet people. It was the perfect conspiracy. Japanese greed and Norwegian cunning. Some sold forbidden machine tools, others sold secret software. It was the deal of the century that punched a hole in the budget of the Soviet Union, leaving millions of people in poverty and facing empty shelves. The Sargasso Sea, 1974. North Atlantic. The ocean here has no shores. For any sailor used to seeking comfort in a strip of land on the horizon, or at least a change in water color indicating the proximity of a shelf, this place is a cursed wasteland, an endless blue abyss. The Sargasso Sea is a unique geographical anomaly of the planet, a giant water lens rotating clockwise, trapped not by rocks, but by moving walls of other more powerful currents. From the west and north it is propped up by the powerful Gulf Stream, from the east by the Canary Current, and from the south by the North Equatorial. The strategic missile submarine cruiser K-415 hung in this stagnant water like a fly frozen in amber. In first-rank Viktor Lyubimov stood in the control center, drilling a non-blinking gaze into the navigational chart where the navigator had just placed a neat pencil cross. Around them on the map was emptiness. No underwater ridges to hide behind from the prowling beams of sonar, no deep canyons to distort sound, no saving acoustic shadow from islands. It was pure, unadulterated geometry of death. Here in the center of this slowly rotating vortex, the water was treacherously transparent like rock crystal for any sound. Lyubimov knew that this sea was a tactical dead end. Its borders were defined by the movement of water, not solid matter. For the commander of a nuclear submarine, this meant a complete absence of walls to press his back against to protect the rear. K-415 was inside a giant aquarium visible from all sides. In this water desert, any sound born of a careless movement of a propeller or a wrench falling onto the deck propagated without hindrance, traveling for many miles, meeting no obstacles that could absorb or scatter it. Depth 180, the bosun reported quietly, almost in a whisper, not tearing his tense gaze away from the depth gauge scale. Lyubimov gave a short nod without turning around. He felt this vulnerability with his skin, with every nerve. There was nowhere to hide here. The only cover was the water column itself, its density, salinity, and temperature. But in a place where there is no geography, physics becomes the only religion. And right now this religion demanded the impossible from them: to disappear in an absolutely empty, brightly lit room. Inside the pressure hull of K-415 the world had shrunk to the size of a steel pipe. The contrast with the boundless, indifferent expanse outside was felt physically here, pressing on the temples with pulsating pain. In the central post, the air was thick, heavy, almost tangible to the touch. The regeneration system was working properly, monotonously driving cubic meters of atmosphere through filters, but it could not completely remove the heavy biological smell of 80 men locked in a closed volume for the third week. It was a heavy, sticky cocktail of odors: machine oil, heated rubber insulation, sharp ozone from high-voltage shields, and acrid, sour human sweat. Viktor Lyubimov took a deep breath, trying to calm his heartbeat. An unpleasant metallic aftertaste of recycled oxygen remained in his mouth, the taste of the Cold War. The dim light of fluorescent lamps, enclosed in special vibration-proof shades, snatched the faces of the officers from the gloom. They were unnaturally pale, with dark sunken circles under their eyes, the stamp of a long absence of the sun. Each of them knew his place. Every movement was honed to automatism by years of training, but in their silence a ringing electric tension showed through. This was not the silence of calm. It was the silence of a string stretched to the limit, ready to snap at any moment. The quiet, barely audible, monotonous hum of ventilation served as the only reminder that time was still moving forward. Here in the depths, the concepts of day and night lost all meaning. There were only endless watches, monstrous pressure, overboard, and nuclear reactor parameters. Lyubimov felt his robe damp from condensation and sweat sticking nastily to his back. The humidity in the compartments was high, almost tropical, but the grave cold from the steel plating in contact with the icy water of the ocean penetrated through layers of clothing, making him shiver. It was condensed tension locked in a volume of a couple of cubic meters. The people here were extensions of complex mechanisms, living appendages to control panels, and each of them clearly understood: one mistake, one wrong turn of a valve, one loud sound, and this steel cocoon would instantly become their common mass grave at the bottom of the Atlantic. Deprived of the opportunity to use the folds of the bottom relief, Viktor Lyubimov bet on the only thing he had left, the inexorable laws of hydroacoustics. Holding 180, he repeated more for himself than for the crew like a mantra. K-415 glided strictly under the layer of the temperature jump. In the Sargasso Sea, where the water is warmed by the scorching sun to a great depth, this layer was especially pronounced and sharp. The boundary between the warm upper water and the icy abyss created a mirror effect for sound waves. The pulses of enemy sonars sent from the surface should hit this layer and reflect back up to the sky, not penetrating into the depths where, holding its breath, the boat crept. Lyubimov imagined this phenomenon as an invisible but solid shield overhead. As long as they were in this temperature shadow for the destroyers and anti-submarine aircraft of NATO, their ship did not exist. They were ghosts. They were a black hole in the water. The captain looked intently at the instrument readings controlling the trim. The boat had to go perfectly evenly, as if on a string. Even the slightest change in depth could throw them above the jump layer, exposing them to a strike, or lead them too deep where monstrous pressure would begin to crush the hull. In the absence of rocks and grottos, the water itself, with its varying density, became for Viktor Lyubimov the only wall separating life from death. He believed in physics. He devoutly believed that the equations written in chalk on the blackboards in the quiet of the Naval Academy classrooms worked here too, in the chaos of the real ocean. Behind the central post in the fourth and fifth compartments rested the main, most weighty argument of the Soviet Union. Vertical missile silos lined up in two strict rows resembled the drum of a giant revolver held to the temple of the planet. 16 ballistic missiles are 27. 16 silent harbingers of the apocalypse. Each missile carried in its warhead a nuclear charge with a yield of 1 megaton. This was more than enough to turn a metropolis the level of Washington or New York into smoking radioactive ruins where gray ash would fall from the sky for years, blocking the sun. Viktor Lyubimov felt the presence of this terrible cargo almost physically, like a leaden weight on his shoulders. He was not just the commander of a ship, he was the keeper of the keys to hell. This deadly cargo made K-415 the most dangerous predator in the world ocean. But the evil irony was that it was the presence of these missiles that turned them into the most desired, most high-priority victim. The Americans would spare no effort or means to find them. The entire Atlantic Fleet of the United States, all the power of their carrier-based aviation and satellite reconnaissance, were honed on one single goal: not to let the covers of these 16 silos open. For now the missiles were sleeping monsters. They stood in their steel nests entangled in thousands of cables and pipelines, cold and silent. 80 men risked their lives, suffocated in stale, stinking air, did not see sunlight for weeks, only to deliver this cargo to the launch point unnoticed. Or, which was the best outcome for all humanity, simply to carry it in circles as a guarantee that the world would not collapse into the abyss. If the order came, these missiles would burst from the calm waters of the Sargasso Sea, tearing the age-old silence with the roar of sustainment engines. But until then, K-415 had to remain a shadow dissolved in the blue. Silence mode in the turbine room rustled, the voice of the mechanic over the intercom barely distinguishable in the speaker. In the aft compartments, people moved smoothly, like in slow-motion filming. The propeller shafts rotated at minimum revolutions, barely pushing the huge multi-ton carcass of the submarine forward. Speed 5 knots. This was the limit beyond which cavitation began, the formation of tiny air bubbles on the edges of the propeller blades. Bursting in the water, these bubbles made a noise that, for the sensitive hydrophones of the enemy, sounded as loud as a machine gun burst in the night. The mechanics stepped softly, their shoes had thick soft rubber soles. Tools were laid out on special mats, excluding any even accidental clank of metal on metal. Loud conversations were strictly forbidden. Even heavy hatch covers were lowered with extreme caution, held by strong hands until the very moment of soft contact with the rubber seal. The main turbo gear unit worked in a special silent mode. Huge mechanisms weighing tens of tons were mounted on complex rubber cord shock absorbers designed to dampen the slightest vibration. Lyubimov knew that in the conditions of the Sargasso Sea, where the background noise of the ocean is minimal due to the absence of storms and surf, any extra sound rings out like a gunshot in the silence of a library. There were no storm waves here masking the noise with their roar. There was no creaking and cracking of ice as in the Arctic. The water was stagnant and treacherously quiet. In this cottony silence, their only chance for survival was to become quieter than the sea itself. To become emptiness. To become nothing. The illusion of safety collapsed in 1 second. The sonar operator in the hydroacoustics room jerked his whole body, tearing the headphones off his head, as if they had suddenly become red hot. His face, usually focused and calm, was distorted by a grimace of acute pain and animal terror. His eyes went wide, looking at the green screen of the oscilloscope. Hydroacoustic contact. His voice broke into a falsetto, cutting the viscous, sleepy silence of the central post. Blashes. Right on course and on the beam. Lyubimov froze, turning into a pillar of salt. Blashes. In the dead silence of the Sargasso Sea, the sound for a professional sonar operator was like thunder. Could not be the sound of a random wave or the jump of a large fish. It was the characteristic, unmistakable sound of heavy metal objects entering the water from a great height. Active hydroacoustic buoys. The captain's heart skipped a beat and then began to beat heavily and hollowly, painfully reverberating in his temples. This was not a chance encounter. In an ocean where for thousands of miles around there is nothing but salt water and rotting algae, buoys do not fall from the sky just like that. The hunter was not just passing by, lazily combing square after square in hope of luck. He knew. He knew exactly where to cast his net. Bearing Lyubimov's voice was dry and rough like sandpaper. He forced himself to speak evenly, maintaining the mask of icy command calm, although inside everything went cold with a bad premonition. 3 contacts. Bearings are changing fast. They are surrounding us, Comrade Commander. They are dropping right on our heads. The navigator, pale as a sheet, quickly made marks on the map. 3 red dots lay around the estimated location of K415. It was a perfect equilateral triangle. Lyubimov looked at the map, and a cold, sticky understanding squeezed his stomach. Such incredible accuracy of the drop in the open ocean where there are no visual landmarks testified to a frightening, impossible awareness of the enemy. The base patrol aircraft was not searching for them by touch, dropping buoys in a checkerboard pattern. The pilots knew the coordinates of the Soviet submarine with an accuracy of tens of meters even before they opened the doors of their bomb bays. The triangle of death had closed. For Viktor Lyubimov, this geometry became the final sentence. His cunning tactic of using the temperature layer had not worked. His hope in physics, in the reflective properties of the thermocline, turned out to be naive self-deception. Someone above saw them through 180 meters of dense water, ignoring all the laws of nature the captain had counted on so much. They saw them just as clearly as if the ocean had suddenly become transparent glass. The Americans were not guessing. They knew. Propeller noise. The sonar operator screamed again, pressing the headphones back to his ears, as if trying to hear the approach of his own death. Bearing 270. High revolutions. It is a warship. Through the transparent thickness of the water, a growing, rhythmic, crushing hum was breaking through. It was low, threatening, like the heavy breathing of a huge beast running after its prey. Classify the target, Lyubimov ordered, feeling his throat go dry. Spruance-class destroyer, the sonar operator reported after a few agonizing seconds. There was complete doom in his voice. Coming at full speed to intercept. Course intersects with ours. Distance closing very fast. Spruance. A specialized submarine killer. A ship stuffed to the brim with the most modern electronics and weaponry, created for only one purpose: to find and ruthlessly destroy Soviet nuclear-powered vessels. In a sea limited only by currents, the appearance of a surface ship going exactly to the intercept point deprived the submariners of the last hope for instrument error or accident. The destroyer did not scour, did not look for a lost trail. It rushed towards them confidently, like a hound unleashed seeing the hare in an open field. Viktor Lyubimov gripped the cold periscope railing so hard his knuckles turned white. The time for stealth had expired. The game of hide and seek was over without really starting. A cruel race for survival was beginning, in which his clumsy heavy missile carrier had a deliberately losing position. And then it happened. The hull of K415 shuddered, as if from the blow of a giant hammer on metal. Ping. The sound was so loud and sharp that it seemed to penetrate the brain, not through the ears but directly through the skin, making teeth and skull bones vibrate. It was not just a sound. It was a physical blow of a compressed sound wave. the strike of an active sonar. The destroyer had illuminated K-415 with its powerful sonar and SQS-53. A powerful electronic pulse stitched through the water column easily pierced the temperature layer, hit the steel hull of the Soviet boat, and returned to the hunter carrying precise deadly data on the distance, speed, and depth of the target. This sound ruthlessly tore the mask of invisibility from the boat. In an instant, 80 men felt absolutely naked. The psychological effect was crushing. In a sea without shores where there is nowhere to hide behind a rock, this ringing ping meant that they were standing in the middle of an empty, brightly lit stage, and from the darkness of the auditorium the black muzzle of a sniper rifle was looking at them. Lyubimov saw the officers in the central post flinch. Some instinctively pulled their heads into their shoulders, expecting a blow. They were detected. They were classified. They were locked on as a target. Now the question was only when the destroyer would decide to fire a torpedo. Alert, Lyubimov roared, trying to drown out the piercing howl of the siren, which immediately filled all compartments. Emergency dive. Full speed ahead. Dive planes down. Going to 300. The deck dropped sharply from under their feet. K-415 dipped her nose and with the heavy grace of a wounded whale rushed into the saving black abyss. The roar of the turbines grew into a high, tense, almost screeching howl. The reactor was reaching full power, throwing colossal energy into the shafts. Men grabbed onto handrails, instruments, valves, trying to keep their balance on the dangerously tilting deck. Maps and pencils rained down from the navigator's table to the floor. But the whole tragedy of the situation was that, in the Sargasso Sea, there was nowhere to run. Lyubimov understood this with crystal frightening clarity. There are no tangled underwater canyons in the labyrinths of which one can confuse the sensitive acoustic homing head of a torpedo. There is no complex bottom relief that would create thousands of false echoes. Around is only water. Endless, homogeneous, empty water. The captain desperately tried to use depth as a shield. 300 meters. 350. The hull began to crackle menacingly under the monstrous pressure, groaning with a metallic voice resisting millions of tons of water. But Lyubimov knew that this was only a short-term reprieve. Modern American Mark 46 torpedoes would easily reach them even at this extreme depth. Maneuvering turned into a senseless run in circles inside a giant aquarium. The walls of this aquarium were absolutely transparent to the enemy. The destroyer above simply turned the rudder, lazily following every movement of the boat like a well-fed cat watching the panic-stricken thrashing of a mouse in a glass jar. While K-415 fell into the abyss trying to gain speed, one terrible paralyzing thought pulsed in Viktor Lyubimov's head. They were waiting for us. This could not be a coincidence. The Americans could not accidentally stumble upon a lone boat in this boundless desert of water and algae. The ocean is too big. The probability of a chance meeting here is negligible. It is equal to 0. They knew the time of passage. They knew the exact route. The realization of this fact was scarier than any sonar ping. The secret order received in a wax-sealed envelope before leaving the base, the order that only he and the political officer knew, turned out to be known to the enemy. Someone had sold them out. Or what was even worse, the Americans possessed some unknown technology that made the entire Soviet strategy of stealth absolutely useless. Lyubimov looked at the fear-distorted faces of his subordinates and understood with horror that his vaunted invisibility was a myth. All these years of grueling training, all these secret instructions on stealth, all these technical tricks with temperature layers and silent running, all of it was useless. The enemy read his actions like an open children's book with large print. The system saw right through them. The depth gauge showed 320 meters. The turbines roared at the limit of their capabilities. The hull vibrated finely from the tension. The boat made a desperate turn, trying to break the lock of the sonar, but every time a new deafening ping ruthlessly hit the plating, confirming, "I see you. You have not gone anywhere." Viktor Lyubimov, commander of a formidable nuclear submarine cruiser, stood in the middle of the central post and with bitterness realized his true position. He was not a hunter hiding in ambush. He was not a predator ready to strike a blow of retribution. He was a target, a bright, clear, glowing dot on the screens of American radars in the global shooting gallery of the SOSUS system. In this sea without shores where there is nowhere to hide his fate, and the fate of his crew now depended completely not on his skill, not on the courage of his men, and not on the power of his missiles. They depended only on the decision of the American captain up there under the bright sun to press the launch button and end this right now, or simply continue to play with them, demonstrating his complete, absolute, and humiliating superiority. Moscow, 1979. In the huge office of Admiral of the Fleet of the Soviet Union Sergei Georgievich Gorshkov, the man who practically created the modern Soviet ocean fleet from scratch, there reigned an atmosphere that subordinates in the reception room whispered was funereal. The heavy oak panels of the walls, darkened by time, seemed to absorb not only sounds but the very light itself. Massive velvet curtains, the color of clotted blood, were tightly drawn, cutting off the view of gray, rainy autumn Moscow, as if the outside world had ceased to exist or did not deserve attention. A thick, acrid layer of tobacco smoke hung in the air, which even the powerful ventilation could not disperse. Sergei Gorshkov sat at his immense desk, motionless like a granite statue. His face, usually expressing strong-willed determination and toughness, now seemed hewn from gray stone covered with a network of deep cracks and wrinkles. He stared with an unseeing glazed gaze at a high stack of cardboard folders with red diagonal stripes and top-secret stamps lying before him on the green baize. These documents were not just dry operational reports of the main naval staff. For Sergei Gorshkov, every page in these folders was a line in the epitaph of his life's work. For 20 years he had built this fleet. For 20 years he had fought for budgets, argued with the Politburo, forced industry to work at the limit of its capabilities to give the Soviet Union a long arm in the ocean. He believed in the power of his creation. But now, in this oppressive silence, broken only by the monotonous, ruthless ticking of the floor clock in the corner, the Admiral looked 10 years older all at once. The clock counted down the seconds to the inevitable and terrible admission which, like poison, was already spreading through the veins of the High Command: the Soviet submarine fleet, the pride of the nation, the nuclear shield to which the whole country prayed, had ceased to be a threat to the likely adversary. It had turned into a target. Sergei Gorshkov reached out a hand, the skin of which resembled parchment, and opened the top folder. He began to leaf through the summaries slowly with a heavy heart, and every new entry hit his professional pride harder than the last, like a stinging slap in the face. The incident with Captain First Rank Viktor Lyubimov in the boundless Sargasso Sea, which happened 5 years ago, was not an isolated tragedy. Then it was written off as an accident, as unique hydrological conditions, as crew error. But now, looking at the summary analytics for 1978 and the beginning of 79, Gorshkov saw a terrible pattern. This was not an accident. This was an epidemic. The reports were speckled with alarming red marks, like a map of military operations lost without a single shot fired. The Northern Fleet, the Pacific Fleet, everywhere the same frightening, irrational picture was observed. Soviet nuclear submarines going on combat patrol were detected by NATO forces almost immediately after crossing the border of the territorial waters of the USSR. Gorshkov read the commander's reports and he felt cold inside. This no longer resembled the classic noble game of cat and mouse, where predator and prey have equal chances of success, where everything depends on skill and cunning. No, it was like a massacre of blind kittens in a bucket. The Americans and the British did not just find Soviet boats, they were waiting for them. They met them at the exit from the bases as one meets guests at a train station. Sergei Gorshkov understood with horror that NATO saw the movements of his submarines in real time. Top-secret combat operations, deployment routes, patrol areas, all this turned into public parades known to every sonar operator in the Pentagon. The ocean, which was supposed to hide them, had betrayed them. He put aside the general summary and picked up a separate report dedicated to the incident with the nuclear submarine project 670 SCAT. Gorshkov remembered how he accepted this project. This submarine, armed with powerful Amethyst cruise missiles with underwater launch capability, was designed as a silent and deadly carrier killer. Its task was to secretly approach the order of a carrier strike group and deliver a crushing blow. However, the dry, emotionless report of naval intelligence painted a picture of complete humiliation. The SCAT was intercepted by a British frigate just 4 hours after it secretly passed the North Cape in the Barents Sea. For hours. The boat did not even have time to reach the open ocean. The British acted brazenly with cynical superiority. They did not attack, they played. The frigate demonstratively escorted the Soviet submarine for 300 miles hanging on its tail. Periodically, they sent powerful pulses of active sonar into the hull of the boat as if knocking on the door, mocking the helplessness of the Soviet sailors. For Sergei Gorshkov, this became a personal insult. His carrier killer, the crown of engineering thought, did not even have time to take a position for attack before it was already conditionally destroyed on the enemy's staff maps. The famous Greenland-Iceland United Kingdom gap, which Soviet strategists considered a difficult but surmountable obstacle, had in fact turned into an impassable concrete wall. Not a single boat could slip through it unnoticed. The Admiral threw aside the folder with the scat and reached for the next document. This was a report on the newest torpedo boat project 671 RT. Syomga. Special hopes were pinned on this ship. The chief designers of the Malachit Bureau swore to Sergei Gorshkov, beat their chests, claiming that this boat would be absolutely invulnerable. His trump card was depth. The Syomga could dive to a working depth of 400 meters and the limit reached 600. The designers assured that at such a depth ordinary surface sonars would not reach it, that layers of water would hide any noise. But the intelligence report was ruthless and destroyed these illusions like a house of cards. The Syomga was detected by American-based Patrol Aviation and Orion aircraft in the very center of the Atlantic. And the most terrible thing was not the fact of detection but how it happened. The planes dropped active hydroacoustic buoys exactly along the course of the boat, completely ignoring its record depth. Sergei Gorshkov, in powerless rage, clenched his fists so hard his knuckles turned white. Billions of rubles invested in creating super-strong hulls from special steel, in developing deep-sea life support systems, in training crews to work under conditions of monstrous pressure, all this gave no tactical advantage. Depth did not save them. The Americans saw through the water column just as clearly as through frosty air. The ocean suddenly became transparent glass for their instruments, an aquarium in which there was nowhere to hide. The Admiral's thoughts returned to those colossal, truly astronomical bills that the Soviet economy uncomplainingly paid for the creation of this fleet. He remembered Project 705 Lira. This was the pinnacle, the titanium age of Soviet shipbuilding. The USSR was the first and only one in the world to begin mass-producing submarines with hulls made of titanium alloys. These high-speed interceptors, which received the code name Alpha in NATO, were true masterpieces of engineering thought. They developed a speed of more than 40 knots underwater, outrunning torpedoes. They were automated to the limit. The crew consisted of only 30 officers. But each such boat cost more than if it had been cast from pure gold of the same weight. The whole country worked for the fleet. Collective farmers in the non-Black Earth region, workers in the Urals, miners in the Donbass, they all, without knowing it, tore resources from their families, from the construction of housing, schools and hospitals, to pay for this titanium. And now, looking at the reports, Sergei Gorshkov understood with icy clarity that these golden fish were practically useless in a real war. Titanium gave incredible lightness, strength, and the absence of a magnetic field, but it did not give the main thing, silence. At a speed of 40 knots, the Lyra roared like a jet fighter taking off. It was heard from the other end of the ocean. Gorshkov realized with bitterness the tragic paradox. They had built the fastest, deepest, most heavily armed, but also the loudest fleet in the world. They had created the perfect weapon for suicide missions. A heavy, insoluble strategic question hung in the smoke-filled office on which the fate of the world depended. The entire military doctrine of the USSR had rested for decades on the unshakable concept of mutually assured destruction. The idea was simple, logical, and cynical. If the United States launched a nuclear strike, first destroying silos on land, the Soviet submarines surviving in the depths of the ocean would deliver a retaliatory strike of vengeance. American cities would turn into radioactive ruins. Fear of this retribution kept the peace. But the reports on Sergei Gorshkov's desk said the opposite. The doctrine had collapsed. If the Americans knew the exact coordinates of every Soviet boat at any moment in time, and the reports confirmed that they knew, then they could launch a preemptive strike. They could destroy all Soviet missile carriers simultaneously, synchronously, even before they received the order to open the silo covers. The nuclear shield which the Kremlin was so proud of, with which they scared the world from the tribunes of party congresses, turned out to be a fiction upon verification. Sergei Gorshkov felt cold sweat run down his back. The Soviet Union stood facing America with a knife in its hand, but this knife, as it suddenly turned out, was made of wet cardboard. The next day, an emergency closed meeting took place in the same office. Sergei Gorshkov summoned the chief designers of the leading design bureaus Rubin and Malekith. It was a brutal dressing down. The admiral, usually restrained, was now furious. He threw secret folders onto the long conference table and papers flew across the polished surface. "Explain to me," his voice thundered, reflecting off the oak panels. "How is this possible? We invest billions. We give you all the resources of the country, and our boats light up on their screens like Christmas trees." The engineers, elderly distinguished men laureates of Lenin prizes, sat pale, sweating and confused. They nervously wiped their glasses, their hands trembled. They mumbled something about impossible physics, about the limiting parameters of the environment. "Comrade Admiral," the chief designer of Rubin began timidly, "according to all our calculations, according to all bench tests, the noise of the boats has been reduced to an acceptable level. We removed the vibration of the turbines, we isolated the pumps." "Then why do they see them?" Gorshkov interrupted, hitting the table with his fist. The engineers glanced at each other. They simply could not believe in such efficiency of American acoustics. It did not fit into their worldview, into their scientific paradigms. In despair, they put forward the only version that could save their reputation. "Comrade Admiral, this is surely a leak," a designer from Malekith said with emphasis. "It is impossible to hear a boat at such a distance purely acoustically. The physics of sound propagation does not allow this. There must be a radio beacon on every ship. Or a spy, a mole who transmits coordinates." Sergei Gorshkov looked at them with undisguised contempt. He saw before him the smartest people in the country who had reached an ideological and scientific dead end. They refused to admit reality because reality meant their professional collapse. It was easier for them to believe in a mythical James Bond screwing a transmitter to the hull of the boat than in the fact that Soviet propellers were simply worse than American ones. The paranoia born in Sergei Gorshkov's office flowed in a black sticky wave into the gloomy corridors of the Lubyanka. Yuri Vladimirovich Andropov, the all-powerful chairman of the KGB, having familiarized himself with the fleet's report, gave the go-ahead for a massive, ruthless purge. In the closed garrisons of the Northern Fleet, Vidyevo, Gadzievo, Zapadnaya, Litsa, Gremika, hell began. Wholesale, humiliating checks overwhelmed the submarine bases. Officers from military counterintelligence literally shook out the personal files of officers. People were called for interrogation in the middle of the night. In cabins and apartments, floors were ripped up, sofa upholstery was torn open, searching for unaccounted radio transmitters, spy equipment, code pads. Everyone was checked, wives, children, distant relatives, up to the 5th generation. If a wife's second cousin was found to have a criminal record or correspondence with abroad, the officer's career was over. Brilliant destinies were broken, shoulder boards flew from shoulders. Honest commanders devoted to the cause, whose only fault was that their noisy boat was detected by the enemy, were dismissed with a permanent black mark, suspected of treason against the motherland. The KGB, with maniacal persistence, looked for a mythical mole with a radio. They were looking for a person who betrayed the fleet. They did not understand that the traitor was not a person. The traitor was the vibration of the steel hull itself, the resonance of poorly processed metal. This witch hunt only demoralized the fleet, driving fear into the souls of sailors, but in no way solving the problem. At the same time, in Moscow, in a feverish search for a rational explanation for what was happening, Soviet scientists put forward the fantastic theory of the cosmic eye. At closed meetings of the Academy of Sciences, authoritative physicists convinced the top leadership that it was not about sound at all. American spy satellites, the academician broadcast pointing with a pointer at a diagram, have learned to see from space the microscopic difference in temperatures on the ocean surface. A nuclear boat leaves a thermal wake behind it. Water heated by the reactor rises to the top. Satellites with infrared sensors see this trail like a road on snow. Everyone liked this version. It was beautiful, technological, and removed the blame from the shipbuilders. The expensive and top-secret Albatros program was immediately launched. The leading institutes of the country, putting aside all business, began to develop special heat-insulating coatings for hulls. Chemists created complex foam-forming compounds that the boat had to eject behind the stern to blur the thermal trail. Tacticians invented cunning surfacing maneuvers. Sergei Gorshkov signed orders for the allocation of colossal funds, grasping at this version like a straw. The Soviet military-industrial complex began to heroically fight the sky and space, building shields against invisible eyes, while the deadly threat came from the dark, cold depths of the ocean. Another group of scientists, not wanting to lag behind, put forward an even more frightening and ominous version: the radiation trail. Their sensors, whispered in the corridors of the headquarters, pick up the tiniest trace amounts of radioactive isotopes. Short-lived nuclides seep through micro-cracks in the primary cooling circuit of reactors. The boat radiates. It leaves behind a glowing path that their sniffers see. A real radiation hysteria began in the fleet. Boats were checked with Geiger counters with maniacal thoroughness, reaching the point of absurdity. Every rivet, every seam was examined 10 times. Technicians and engineers were punished with the guardhouse for the slightest violations of tightness. Crews were driven to nervous breakdowns by endless checks of the reactor core. This version was very convenient for everyone. It explained all failures by invisible and elusive radiation against which there is no defense. But it, like the thermal trail theory, diverted attention from the real simple and crude problem: acoustics. The Soviet fleet desperately fought its own ships, the physics of the atom ignoring sound as the main unmasking factor. The shocking information finally reached the very top, the Politburo of the Central Committee of the CPSU. The aging leaders of the USSR, accustomed to considering themselves the masters of half the world, sitting in the soft armchairs of the Kremlin, suddenly realized that their main trump card in the geopolitical game had been beaten. The feeling of imperial security, the inviolability of borders, was replaced by a sticky animal sensation of complete nakedness before the enemy. Yuri Andropov and Minister of Defense Dmitry Fedorovich Ustinov, reading Gorshkov's secret reports, understood the terrible truth: if the Third World War starts tomorrow, the USSR will lose it in the first 15 minutes. They will lose their entire naval nuclear potential even before they have time to give an order. This knowledge spawned dangerous nervousness in strategic decision-making. Animal fear of a sudden disarming strike by the USA pushed the Soviet leadership towards aggressive rhetoric. They decided to compensate for vulnerability with quantity, with a constant increase in combat readiness, with a demonstration of force. This only increased the tension of the Cold War, tightening the spiral of confrontation. The Kremlin felt like a beast cornered, ready to bite out of fear because its armor turned out to be full of holes. The tragedy of the situation lay in the monstrous blindness of a huge empire. While the KGB broke people's lives in polar garrisons looking for non-existent spies with radios, while the best minds of Soviet science spent millions of rubles building protection against mythical space lasers and infrared satellites, while admirals wrote new instructions for masking thermal trails. The true reason for the catastrophe lay quietly at the bottom of the ocean, covered with age-old silt and darkness. Neither Sergei Gorshkov nor Dmitry Ustinov nor the best analysts of Soviet intelligence, due to their ideological blinkers, could admit a simple offensive thought. The thought that the Americans simply listen to the ocean better. That their technologies, their computers, their hydrophones are head and shoulders above. They became victims of their own propaganda about the unconditional historical technical superiority of socialism. They looked up into space expecting a strike from there. They looked around, peering into the faces of their comrades, looking for traitors. But none of them guessed to look down. And there in the black abyss, the American SOSUS system, a network of thousands of ultrasensitive hydrophones entangling the bottom of the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, was methodically, dispassionately, and around the clock writing acoustic portraits of their invisible boats. Every creak, every noise of a propeller, every knock of a pump was entered into the database, signing the sentence of a superpower that was deaf to its own loudness. The history of global surveillance began not with the development of a new deadly weapon, but with the fundamental physics of the ocean. In the late 40s of the 20th century, when the world was just beginning to cool down from the fire of the Second World War, American oceanographers Maurice Ewing and Joe Wurzel made a revolutionary discovery that forever changed the rules of warfare at sea. Scientists discovered the existence of a unique acoustic phenomenon. At a depth of about 1,000 meters, in a layer of water sandwiched between warm surface masses and the colossal pressure of the icy abyss, sound waves behaved anomalously. They fell into a kind of physical trap which would later be called the SOSUS channel. In this corridor, sound did not scatter, did not go into the silt to bottom, and did not die out on the surface breaking against the waves. It propagated horizontally for thousands of kilometers like a giant natural optical fiber created by the planet itself. Maurice Ewing decided to prove the theory with practice. In 1949, a research vessel dropped a small TNT charge near the Bahamas. The explosion occurred at the calculated depth. Sensors installed off the coast of West Africa at a distance of more than 3,000 miles clearly recorded this pop. The sound passed through the entire Atlantic Ocean, having lost almost none of its energy. The High Command of the United States Naval Forces instantly realized the strategic chilling essence of this discovery. The ocean, which for millennia was considered a wall isolating continents, was actually a perfect telephone line. And this line could be tapped. In an atmosphere of the strictest state secrecy comparable only to the secrecy surrounding nuclear codes, the Pentagon initiated Project Caesar. It was an engineering gamble comparable in its scale, technical complexity, and budget to the Apollo space program or the Manhattan Project. The general contract for implementation was awarded to the Western Electric Corporation, the manufacturing wing of the telecommunications giant AT&T. The task set before the engineers of Western Electric seemed impossible: to turn the bottom of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans into a single continuous sensor network. Under the reliable cover of a legend about laying transatlantic telephone cables and conducting peaceful oceanographic research, U.S. factories began the production of thousands of tons of specialized equipment. Project Caesar quickly became one of the most expensive secrets of the Cold War. It consumed budgets comparable to the construction of several full-fledged carrier strike groups. But this astronomical money of American taxpayers did not go to armor, gunpowder, or rocket fuel. It turned into kilometers of copper wire, tons of special rubber, and containers with ultrasensitive electronics. Special cable ships such as the USNS Mizar went out into the open sea to carry out the most massive and complex laying of communications in the history of mankind. These ships, looking like ordinary civilian laborers, carried the future dominance of America in their holds. The crews of the Mizar worked around the clock in the harshest weather conditions of the North Atlantic. Huge drums on the stern unwound an endless black snake of armored cable. At certain intervals, arrays of hydrophones were attached to the core, complex structures the size of a city bus packed in protective casings capable of withstanding pressure of hundreds of atmospheres. These giant ears were installed at key strategic lines chosen with surgical precision. They lay on the edges of the continental shelf of the USA, stretched along the misty ridge of the Aleutian Islands. But the most important section was the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom line, the famous GIUK gap. These were the gates through which Soviet boats had to pass to get into the Atlantic. Western Electric engineers fought storms, underwater landslides, tearing cables, and the monstrous pressure of water. They created a network that has no right to make a mistake and has no blind spots. Cables stretched for hundreds of miles along the bottom, connecting silent icy depths with shore posts, turning the wild, unbridled ocean into a strictly controlled territory ruled into squares. By the mid-50s, scattered chains of hydrophones were combined into a single integrated system, SOSUS. From that moment, Project Caesar ceased to be a scientific experiment or an engineering construction site. It became the constantly operating, never-sleeping nervous system of the world ocean. Hydrophones lying on the bottom in total darkness and cold possessed phenomenal, almost supernatural sensitivity. They were capable of picking up sound with a power of less than 1 watt at a distance of hundreds of kilometers. The ocean came alive. The SOSUS system listened to absolutely everything. It heard the mournful drawn-out mating songs of blue whales migrating south. It registered the low rumble of distant underwater earthquakes when tectonic plates rubbed against each other. It recorded the rhythmic noise of the propellers of commercial cargo ships and tankers crossing the ocean. And of course it heard the specific unique noises of Soviet submarines. The ocean, which for centuries was considered a zone of chaos, great mystery, and silence, became transparent to the American military. The scariest thing for the Soviet Union was that the SOSUS system worked completely passively. It did not emit anything into the water, it did not give itself away by a single pulse. Soviet admirals did not even suspect that every square meter of the Atlantic was under round-the-clock total surveillance. Information from thousands of bottom hydrophones flowed to the shore via thick cables. The end point of this data stream were NAVFAC posts, naval facilities for shore surveillance. These were inconspicuous deaf concrete bunkers without windows surrounded by rows of barbed wire. They were located in secluded, strategically important points on the wind-blown Cape Hatteras, on the tropical island of Barbados, on the rocky coast of California. From the outside they looked like warehouses or transformer booths, but inside these structures reigned the atmosphere of a sterile operating room or an advanced scientific laboratory. In halls lit by cold artificial light sat rows of young U.S. Navy operators. They wore headphones and looked at walls of complex electronic equipment. These people were completely isolated from the outside world and sunlight. Their service consisted of hours of monotonous hypnotic waiting interrupted by moments of the highest tension. These operators were America's first line of defense, but they did not see the ocean. They only heard it. In these air-conditioned bunkers, chaotic natural sound turned into clear structured intelligence data, and the abstract noise of water into precise target coordinates for potential nuclear strikes. The main tool of the NAVFAC operators became not sound speakers but visual spectrograms, which in professional slang were called waterfalls. In front of each operator was a recorder from which an endless roll of special thermal paper slowly crawled out. The paper was covered with millions of black dashes and dots. On these tapes, sound was visualized, time went vertically, sound frequency horizontally. For an uninitiated person who accidentally looked over the operator's shoulder, these black dots and lines looked like random garbage, like static noise on the screen of a broken TV. But for a trained specialist, the waterfall was an open book telling the story of the ocean in real time. Stable, even straight lines stretching across the entire sheet meant the operation of mechanisms. Intermittent, chaotic dashes betrayed biological noises or weather phenomena. NAVFAC operators learned for years to read these graphs as an experienced conductor reads a complex score. They knew how to visually separate the noise of rain drumming on the surface of the water hundreds of miles away from the rhythmic, dangerous, barely noticeable hum coming from the propellers of a submarine creeping in the depths. For the SOSUS system, a Soviet nuclear submarine such as K-415 appeared not as a single stealthy object swimming in silence. On screens and paper tapes it looked like a collection of hundreds of rumbling mechanisms enclosed in a resonating steel hull. Turbines rotated at breakneck speed. Powerful circulation pumps pumped tons of water every second to cool the reactor core. Heavy gearboxes transmitted monstrous torque to the propeller shaft. Each of these units, due to the imperfection of Soviet metalworking due to tolerances and backlashes, created strong vibration. The hull of the boat worked like the membrane of a giant underwater speaker, broadcasting this mechanical chaos directly into the SOFAR sound channel. The Americans heard not just a boat. They heard a whole factory working underwater. The noise of Soviet submarines of the first and second generations was so strong and characteristic that in the cynical slang of SOSUS operators, they were called roaring cows. Their continuous mechanical mooing drowned out even the natural sounds of the ocean, scaring whales and making the work of sonar operators easier. The SOSUS system allowed achieving incredible frightening detail in technical intelligence. An experienced operator at a post in Norfolk could not just say, "I hear a Russian boat." Looking at the black lines of the waterfall, he could confidently state, "I hear a nuclear submarine project 667A, hull number presumably K415. Such accuracy was achieved thanks to unique defects. Each boat had its own handwriting. One had a slightly whistling bearing of the right turbogenerator giving parasitic noise at a frequency of 55 Hz. Another had a microcrack on the propeller blade which sang at certain revolutions. A third had a knocking pump of the third circuit. Each Soviet boat acquired its own unique inimitable acoustic passport, its sound fingerprint. American naval intelligence compiled detailed, thick catalogs of these sound signatures. As soon as the boat went to SOSUS, computers and operators compared its noise with the database and instantly identified the specific pennant. Anonymity in the ocean no longer existed. Each Soviet submarine wore an invisible badge with the name and rank of the commander, which it itself loudly broadcast to the whole world. The key decisive advantage of the SOSUS system was work with infrasound. These were ultra-low frequency oscillations 5, 10, 20 Hz, which the human ear is basically incapable of perceiving. High frequency sounds: the whistle of steam, the creak of metal, the hiss of water quickly decay in a dense medium absorbed by water after a few dozen miles. But low frequencies generated by the rotation of heavy multi-ton propeller shafts and the operation of powerful pumps possess colossal energy and penetrating power. They can travel around half the globe practically without losing their strength. Soviet designers spent huge efforts, money, and time on reducing noise in the audible range so that they would not be heard by sonar operators on other ships in close proximity. But they overlooked the global physics of infrasound. For SOSUS spectral analyzers, these low-frequency waves were the brightest beacon searchlights in the night, pointing to the exact position of the boat even from the other edge of a giant ocean basin. A single SOSUS station could only give a bearing, a line of direction to the sound source. The operator knew that the boat was somewhere on this line but did not know exactly where. But the main power of the system lay in its global network structure. When K415 was detected by a station on the island of Newfoundland, the data was instantly transmitted via secure communication channels to a single center. There they were compared with the bearing received from the station in the Azores and from the station in Iceland. Operators drew 3 straight lines on the map. The point of their intersection formed a small triangle. These were the exact geographical coordinates of the boat. This triangulation method allowed tracking the target continuously for days and weeks, passing it hand to hand from one observation sector to another like a baton. In control centers on large tables lay maps of the Atlantic where red markers drew the routes of Soviet patrols. These routes looked like straight lines leading Soviet submariners straight into prearranged traps of anti-submarine aviation and the NATO fleet. The tragedy of the situation lay in the deep gap between reality and perception. Soviet sailors, captains like Viktor Lyubimov, sincerely believed in their stealth. They were professionals of the highest class. They strictly observed radio silence, not going on the air for weeks. They moved at low speeds, saving resources and reducing noise. They used complex evasion maneuvers and hid for hours under layers of temperature jumps. They thought they were creeping in absolute darkness on tiptoe, not making a sound, merging with the black water. But in the objective reality created by the SOSUS system, they were stomping in heavy hobnailed boots on a booming parquet floor in an empty hall. This monstrous contrast between the subjective feeling of safety of Soviet submariners and the reality of their complete, absolute vulnerability created an atmosphere of impending catastrophe. Crews lived, served, wrote letters home, and dreamed of vacation being in a complete illusion of safety. While their fates had long been decided by young operators in NAVFAC bunkers located thousands of miles away from them. By the end of the 70s of the 20th century, the United States naval forces reached absolute information dominance in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The ocean ceased to be the great mute keeping its secrets. Thanks to Project Caesar and the SOSUS system, the water column became a transparent medium completely controlled by American electronics. The Americans turned a fundamental physical property of water, its unique sound conductivity, into a strategic weapon. And this weapon proved to be more effective than any homing torpedoes and depth charges. The Soviet Union continued to build huge steel leviathans, arming them with missiles capable of burning the world. But the Kremlin did not understand that in this new silent war, it is not the thickness of the armor and not the power of the thermonuclear warhead that wins. The winner is the one who is able to hear the enemy first in the endless waterfall of ocean sounds. And in this battle for silence, the Soviet Union had already lost without even noticing it. Norfolk, Virginia, 1980. The history of the collapse of Soviet naval strategy, a colossal geopolitical failure that cost billions of rubles, began not in the high offices of the Kremlin with carpeted floors and not in the secret bunkers of the Pentagon. It began in a smoke-filled, beer-stained bar on the outskirts of Norfolk where John Anthony Walker sat at a shaky table. This man, a warrant officer of the United States Naval Forces, did not look at all like an ideological communist ready to die for the ideals of Marx or a brilliant spy from Hollywood movies drinking a martini. John Walker looked exactly like what he was, a loser mired in debt, angry at life with a broken marriage, and a cheap wig on his head designed to hide early baldness. He nervously twirled a glass of cheap whiskey in his hands, periodically glancing at his watch. His thoughts were occupied not by the fate of the world, but by overdue bills for the bar he was trying to run and the need to repair an old car. He needed money, fast cash. In Washington, right under the nose of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, John Walker led a double life for years, which seemed to him nothing more than a dangerous but profitable business. Using his high security clearance and his official position at the communications center of the Atlantic Fleet, he turned betrayal into a routine. Walker did not use microfilms hidden in the heel of a shoe or complex electronic devices. His method was laughably primitive and therefore incredibly effective. He simply took secret documents from the desk, copied them on a standard office Xerox machine, and then hid the stacks of paper in black plastic garbage bags. Later, under the cover of darkness, he drove out into the forests of Maryland. There, among rotting leaves and damp earth, he left these bags in agreed places, dead drops marked by an empty cola can or a broken branch. For John Walker, it was simply an exchange of goods for an envelope with crisp dollar bills. He sold the national security of his country for the price of a used sedan, never even suspecting that his petty Philistine greed would change the balance of power in the Cold War more radically than any missile crisis. On that humid evening of 1980, John Walker was preparing another package for transfer. Usually the Soviet residency with which he worked was interested only in the keys to the KW7 encryption machines. These keys were the gold standard of intelligence, allowing Moscow to read diplomatic correspondence and orders of the American fleet in real time. But this time Walker needed extra money. He wanted to curry favor with his handlers, show his usefulness, and get an extraordinary bonus. He rummaged through the stacks of papers he had taken from his shift and decided to add something to the ciphers that seemed impressive in volume, although boring in content. It was the complete archive of operational acoustic summaries of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet for the past 3 years. Walker carelessly shoved the thick journals filled with endless columns of numbers, frequency graphs, and technical comments into a garbage bag on top of the encryption tables. For him, it was just waste paper ballast for weight. The Soviet intelligence officers in Washington who picked up the package from the dead drop were also not narrow specialists in hydroacoustics. They briefly looked through the papers, saw that these were not political documents and not blueprints for a new missile, and shrugged their shoulders. The package was sealed, placed in diplomatic mail, and sent by the next Aeroflot flight to Moscow. From Moscow, after a short sorting at the KGB Center at the Lubyanka, the strange journals were sent north to Leningrad. There, behind the high fence of a specialized closed research institute of the Navy, these documents lay on the table of a group of analysts awaiting another routine job of deciphering radio intercepts. In the spacious but poorly lit hall of the institute there was silence broken only by the rustling of pages and the scratching of pens. A group of Soviet naval analyst officers began studying the materials received from Agent Johnny. At first the work went sluggishly and without enthusiasm. The officers sitting at wide tables piled with maps and reference books were used to seeing only general vague phrases in such intercepts. Usually intelligence brought data on the departure of carrier groups, on schedules of training firing, or on the change of call signs. It was useful but predictable information. The captain second rank, who led the group, lazily turned the page of an American report dated 1978. He took a sip of cold tea and began to translate the text, checking with a dictionary of naval terms. However, as he read into the dry lines and began to compare them with his own secret maps of the combat deployment of Soviet submarines, an expression of boredom on his face began to change to bewilderment. Then bewilderment grew into tension. "Sergei Ivanovich, look at this," he said quietly, turning to his neighbor. "There is some mistake in the dates here, or I am going crazy." The neighbor moved closer, ran his eyes over the lines, and his eyebrows crept up. The atmosphere in the room changed abruptly. The sleepy routine disappeared, giving way to electric tension, which with every minute turned into cold panic. The officers began to pass sheets to each other, feverishly leafing through the journals of combat operations hanging on the stands. The analysts began to realize with horror that before them was not just staff correspondence or analytical forecasts. It was a detailed minute-by-minute log of observations of the entire Soviet submarine fleet in the Atlantic. The Americans described the secret movements of Soviet boats not as hypotheses, guesses, or probable patrol areas. They described them as accomplished, documented facts. The reports indicated the exact time of passing control points, the depth of immersion with an accuracy of a meter, and the course with an accuracy of a degree. What was considered a secret behind 7 seals in the Soviet Union, for the sake of which crews did not go on the air for months, looked in these carelessly copied American documents like an open schedule of suburban trains on a station wall. The culmination of the analysis was the discovery of a specific entry dated the 14th of October 1978. The head of the group, whose hands were already noticeably trembling red, allowed the report on tracking an object which the Americans classified in their documents as Yankee class, which corresponded to the Soviet Project 667A Navaga. The officers rushed to the safe, took out the secret ship logs of the Northern Fleet for that year. The comparison took only a few minutes. The data matched perfectly. It was the strategic missile submarine cruiser K-415 under the command of Captain First Rank Viktor Lyubimov. But the real soul-chilling horror was caused not by the fact of the boat's detection itself. Boats had been detected before. The horror was caused by a note made by an American sonar operator in the column contact identification. There, in black and white in standard naval English, it was written: "Contact established, classified," and confirmed by the characteristic rhythmic knocking in a worn bearing of the circulation pump of the third cooling circuit of the port side reactor. Beat frequency 55 Hz. This sentence acted on the reading officers like a high-voltage shock. Dead silence hung in the room. Only the hum of the fluorescent lamp under the ceiling could be heard. The Americans did not just see a blurry spot on the radar screen. They did not just hear the noise of propellers. They heard a specific tiny detail located deep inside the strong steel hull of the boat. They knew the technical condition of this bearing better than the mechanic of the boat itself. And they used this sound as a unique identifier, as a fingerprint, to distinguish K-415 from any other boat of the same series. "This is impossible," whispered one of the analysts, pale as a sheet. "The pump is inside the hull. The hull is lined with rubber. Water muffles sound. It is physically impossible to hear this 500 miles away." Leading Soviet shipbuilders and acoustic experts from the Rubin Design Bureau were urgently summoned to the Institute for consultation. When they were shown the translated documents, their first reaction was categorical denial. An elderly engineer, a laureate of the State Prize, nervously wiped his glasses and shook his head. "This is disinformation," he heatedly poked his finger at the paper. "The circulation pump is surrounded by layers of powerful sound insulation. It stands on shock absorbers. The boat itself is under hundreds of meters of water. To hear a bearing defect the size of a fist at a distance of hundreds of kilometers is like hearing the ticking of a wristwatch on a person standing on the other side of a roaring stadium during a football match. Physics does not allow this. However, John Walker's documents were inexorable. As proof photocopies of spectrograms, the very waterfalls that the SOSUS system recorders drew were attached to the reports. On them, the rhythmic trace, this signature of the pump, was visible in clear black lines. Frequency characteristics and precise diagnoses of mechanical problems of other Soviet boats were given. The experts, crushed by the weight of the evidence, fell silent. They sat stooped looking at these graphs, and their world was crumbling. They had to admit the terrible truth: the American SOSUS system possessed a resolution that was decades ahead of the boldest, most fantastic Soviet ideas about hydroacoustics. What the USSR considered a safe natural noise background of the ocean was for the USA a sterile silence in which any squeak sounded like a cannon shot. The head of the analytical group, Captain First Rank, locked himself in his office to compile the final report for the Admiral of the Fleet of the Soviet Union, Sergei Georgievich Gorshkov. It was perhaps the most difficult and dangerous document in his career. He had to inform the all-powerful commander-in-chief, a man with an iron character, that his entire fleet, all his strategies, all his victorious reports and presentations to the Politburo for the last 20 years were based on a dangerous, deadly illusion. The officer understood that this report could cost him his shoulder boards, his career, and possibly his freedom. Messengers with bad news were often executed in history, but it was impossible to remain silent any longer. The price of the lie was too high. He typed the text with one finger on a typewriter, carefully choosing words, but the facts spoke for themselves. The folder, stamped top priority, was sealed with red sealing wax. A special courier took it to deliver it to Moscow by the night train. This folder contained irrefutable proof that the Americans were not reading tea leaves. They possessed true X-ray vision in the ocean. Every page of this report was a nail in the coffin of the Soviet doctrine of stealth. Moscow. Main Staff of the Navy. Sergei Gorshkov's office. When the Admiral opened the package and began to read the report based on John Walker's materials, his reaction was far from the anger or rage that his subordinates feared so much. Gorshkov slowly sank into his chair. His face turned gray. It was a state of deep, paralyzing shock bordering on human despair. The Admiral, accustomed to thinking in global categories, operating with fleets and squadrons, instantly realized the true monstrous scale of the catastrophe. The entry about the pump of K-415 destroyed his picture of the world to the ground. All these years he had sent his sons thousands of Soviet submariners to sea on autonomous voyages, confident that they were protected by the water column, the armor of the hull, and the regime of secrecy. He believed that he was giving them a sword and a shield. Now, looking at the American spectrograms, he understood with horror that he had been sending them into a transparent glass aquarium. And around this aquarium sat American operators with notebooks and stopwatches, calmly recording every movement. The realization that the enemy knew about the technical condition of his ships better than his own mechanics at the bases in Gadzievo and Vidyevo was a severe personal and professional blow for Sergei Gorshkov. The myth of the invulnerability of the Soviet submarine force, which he had built all his life, collapsed in 1 hour of reading. Following Gorshkov, this realization came to the entire Soviet high command. Generals and admirals admitted with bitterness that for decades they had been playing a game with the USA, the rules of which were falsified by the enemy from the very beginning. The USSR spent colossal resources, human material, and time on operational camouflage. Complex plans for false maneuvers were developed. The strictest radio silence was introduced when boats remained silent for 3 months. Captains like Viktor Lyubimov showed miracles of navigation and personal courage, passing dangerous sections of the ocean, risking the lives of the crew. But the documents from John Walker's garbage bag ruthlessly showed that all this was in vain. All these efforts went into the void. The Americans did not need to intercept encrypted radio messages. They did not need to watch periscopes from satellites. They just needed to listen to the ocean. This discovery devalued the heroism and skill of thousands of Soviet sailors. Their professionalism did not matter because their own equipment betrayed them every second. A boat could perfectly execute tactical maneuvers, a commander could be a tactical genius, but a defective bearing made at a factory somewhere in the Urals with a tolerance violation of 1 micron screamed to the whole ocean, "I am here. Shoot here." Following the military shock, economic shock came to the Kremlin. The Politburo of the Central Committee of the CPSU and the State Planning Committee realized the monstrous, unbearable price of this strategic error. The Soviet Union had invested hundreds of billions of rubles, a colossal lion's share of the national budget, in the construction of hundreds of nuclear submarines of the first and second generations. This was money literally taken away from agriculture, which was suffocating without machinery, from medicine, from light industry, from ordinary citizens standing in lines for sausage. And now it turned out that these giant investments, this labor of the people, were essentially thrown into the cold ocean. The fleet built at the cost of the impoverishment of the people turned out to be combat-ready only on paper and in bravura propaganda films. The realization of sunk costs caused a quiet but all-encompassing panic in the Kremlin. To rebuild the entire fleet from scratch meant finally ruining the country whose economy was already bursting at the seams. But to leave everything as it is meant admitting complete unconditional defeat in the Cold War and becoming defenseless. In the light of the revealed facts, the nondescript, pathetic figure of John Walker acquired a sinister, almost mystical scale in the eyes of the Soviet leadership. In Moscow they understood with horror that this inconspicuous American with bad teeth, a cheap wig and bar debts did more to defeat the defense of the USSR than all the Nimitz carriers and B-52 strategic bombers combined. He did not just sell secrets. He sold a mirror in which the Soviet Union for the first time without embellishment and propaganda saw its true ugly and vulnerable reflection. John Walker, without knowing or wishing it, acted as a ruthless pathologist. He opened the corpse of Soviet military power even before the patient officially died and showed everyone the rotting insides. His betrayal became the catalyst that launched irreversible processes in the Soviet military-industrial complex, forcing a huge, clumsy system to work to exhaustion in an attempt to close the discovered breach. Analysts of the General Staff, having studied Walker's documents in detail, came to a disappointing conclusion. In the language of chess so loved in the USSR, this position was called zugzwang, a situation where any move by a player leads to a worsening of his position. If Soviet boats are taken out into the ocean in the event of a crisis or the start of a war, they will be immediately destroyed by a preemptive strike. The Americans know their coordinates in real-time. Torpedoes are already aimed. If they are left in protected bases at the piers under the cover of air defense, they will become an easy stationary target for cruise missiles and aviation. They will be burned right in the harbors without ever fulfilling their task of nuclear deterrence. The USSR had no good moves left. The American SOSUS system actually put the Soviet Union in a strategic checkmate. The nuclear parity, which was maintained for years with such difficulty, sweat, and blood, turned out to be a fiction. It was not just a technical lag in electronics or metallurgy. It was a complete intellectual defeat in the battle for the world ocean. The chapter of this drama ended with the adoption of a fatal and expensive decision. Despite the deep economic crisis, despite the shortage and problems inside the country, the Kremlin decided to accept the challenge. John Walker's documents became the trigger for a new, even more insane and ruinous arms race. In a closed resolution of the Politburo, it was stated firmly: make Soviet boats quiet at any cost, regardless of expenses, regardless of resources. A feverish search for technologies around the world began. Soviet intelligence received an order to obtain machine tools capable of machining propellers with micron precision to remove this accursed noise. This search would eventually lead to a scandalous secret operation with the Japanese company Toshiba and the Norwegian Kongsberg. But at that moment in 1980, in the offices of Moscow reigned the gloomy determination of the doomed. Admirals and party bosses knew the truth, and this truth was scarier than any war. The enemy hears even how their fleet breathes. And to fix this, the country will have to tear its veins and put the last remnants of its economy under the knife. Leningrad, 1981. In a sterile, clean, soundproof hall of the Kremlin Central Research Institute, a group of leading Soviet engineers and hydrodynamicists gathered around a large table. On the table lay not blueprints but the results of computer simulations and intelligence data. The scientists' faces were gloomy. They had just delivered a final ruthless diagnosis of the disease that had been undermining the power of the Soviet fleet for decades. "This is cavitation, comrades," a gray-haired professor said, hollowly pointing with a pointer at a graph. "We are tilting at windmills trying to muffle turbines and pumps. But the main traitor is outside." In the silence of the hall, this word sounded like a sentence. Cavitation. A physical process in which zones of sharp pressure drop occur behind a rapidly rotating propeller blade. Water in these zones literally boils at normal temperature, forming thousands of tiny steam bubbles. A moment later, these bubbles collapse under the pressure of the environment. Every such collapsing bubble is a micro-explosion, the professor continued. And when there are millions of them per second, it creates a monstrously powerful broadband noise. For a sonar operator on an American destroyer, it sounds like rocks rattling in a working concrete mixer. The problem was not ignorance of physics but technology. Soviet industry knew how to cast super-strong titanium hulls capable of withstanding the pressure of a kilometer-deep water column. It knew how to create compact and powerful nuclear reactors. But it did not possess the culture of precision metalworking. Propellers for nuclear giants were cast in earthen molds and then finished by hand. Teams of workers in respirators crawled over huge bronze blades with handheld grinders and files, trying to give them the desired shape by eye. This ruled out perfect geometry. Every microscopic bump, every irregularity on the surface of the blade became a point of flow separation, an acoustic beacon that screamed to the whole ocean, "I am here." The engineers understood to make the boat silent, it needed fundamentally new propellers. Of a complex, curved, saber-like shape machined with micron precision. But it was impossible to make such propellers by hand. Despondency bordering on panic reigned in the Ministry of Shipbuilding Industry of the USSR. At closed meetings, officials and factory directors realized with bitterness the technological abyss that had opened up between East and West. "We are at a dead end," the deputy minister admitted, nervously breaking a pencil. "Our machine tools are reliable, massive dinosaurs. They can process giant parts for tanks, tractors, and rolling mills. But they are blind and crude." One of the chief designers of the Malachite Bureau joked grimly, "We can cast the world's largest bell, the Tsar bell. But we cannot make a Stradivarius violin. And the ocean demands exactly a violin." To create low-noise, saber-like propellers, multi-axis milling machines with numerical control were required. These were complex machines capable of simultaneously rotating a multi-ton part and a cutting tool in 9 planes following a complex mathematical model. In the USSR, such technologies simply did not exist. Soviet electronics lagged a generation behind. Developing domestic machines of this class would take decades, years of research and development, years of testing, years of implementation. And the country did not have these years. American missiles were already standing in Europe and Soviet boats were targets. A cynical but the only possible decision was made. Not to reinvent the wheel but to steal it. The task moved from the plane of engineering thought to the plane of foreign intelligence and illegal trade. The Committee for State Security of the USSR, together with the Foreign Trade Association Techmashimport, began developing one of the most daring operations of the Cold War. The goal was to bypass the tough sanctions of COCOM, the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls. This organization, created by NATO countries, strictly ensured that dual-use technologies did not fall into the socialist camp. Soviet agents working under the cover of trade missions in Tokyo began to carefully probe the ground. Their target became the Japanese corporation Toshiba machine. The Japanese were famous for their advanced electronics and precision mechanics. In their product line was exactly what the Soviet Union required: giant milling machines model MBP 110. The KGB plan was simple and brazen. Buy these machines under the guise of harmless equipment for purely civilian needs. Official requests stated that the machines were necessary for the production of rotors for large electric generators or for processing molds for plastic products. It was playing with fire. If Washington learned about the impending deal, a grandiose international scandal would erupt. Japan, the closest U.S. ally in Asia, would be under attack. But the stake, the survival of the Soviet nuclear fleet, was too high to fear diplomatic notes. In 1982, secret meetings began in Tokyo offices and closed rooms of expensive restaurants. At the tables sat impeccably dressed representatives of Techmashimport and top managers of Toshiba Machine. Japanese businessmen were not naive. They perfectly understood why the Russians suddenly needed these giant 9-axis monsters. No civilian generators require such prohibitive precision in processing complex curved surfaces. They knew that these machines would turn propellers for submarines. However, greed prevailed over Allied duty to the U.S.A. and even over their own national security. A contract worth about $17 million, huge money at that time, turned out to be too tempting a piece of pie. The management of Toshiba Machine decided to close their eyes to the identity of the end user. They committed a direct crime. Technical documentation was forged. In export papers complex C and C, milling machines magically turned into simple vertical turning lathes allowed for free sale. Corporate greed became that breach in the defense of the West through which the USSR received the keys to silence. But machines alone, hardware alone, were not enough. To control this complex mechanics, advanced software and special electronic controllers were required. Toshiba could not supply them without the risk of immediate exposure, as Japanese export legislation in the field of electronics was particularly strict. Here Norway came into play. NATO member country, a loyal U.S. ally in Northern Europe, turned out to be the weak link in the alliance. Soviet representatives contacted the state company Kongsberg Vapenfabrik, or rather its trading division Kongsberg Trade. Representatives of Kongsberg, also driven by the desire to make money on a rich Soviet customer, agreed to supply the USSR with NC 2000 controllers. It was these control units that were necessary for the operation of Japanese machines. This turned the operation into a real international conspiracy. Japanese hardware and Norwegian brains were to meet in Leningrad to create the perfect weapon against the NATO fleet. Soviet intelligence played brilliantly on internal contradictions and commercial interests within the Western Bloc, proving that capitalists are indeed ready to sell the rope on which they will be hanged. A complex logistical operation began to deliver the forbidden cargo. Machines weighing hundreds of tons were dismantled into parts in Toshiba workshops. They were packed in huge wooden crates without markings and loaded onto the Soviet merchant ship Latigales in the port of Yokohama. To cover tracks and confuse possible CIA surveillance, the route was laid through third countries. False destinations were indicated in the ship's bills of lading. The Latigales zigzagged across the oceans like a hare. At the same time, Norwegian specialists from Kongsberg were smuggling their equipment and floppy disks with software across the border using holes in customs control. All threads converged in Leningrad on Vasilevsky Island, on the territory of the famous Baltic shipyard. The KGB ensured unprecedented secrecy measures during unloading. Ordinary port workers and dockers were removed from the pier. The perimeter was guarded by armed special forces. Crates with the Toshiba logo, which was hastily painted over, were brought into a specially prepared renovated workshop. This workshop became the most guarded point in the city, ground zero of the Soviet technological breakthrough. The USSR finally got its hands on tools capable of changing the balance of power in the ocean. The most cynical and surreal moment of the operation came in the winter of 1983. Groups of Japanese and Norwegian engineers arrived in Leningrad on tourist visas. They had to assemble and set up the equipment with their own hands. Citizens of NATO member countries and U.S. Allies people whose countries were in the crosshairs of Soviet missiles were assembling machines that would produce propellers for Soviet nuclear missile carriers. A strange atmosphere reigned in the huge, echoing workshop of the Baltic shipyard. Japanese in branded overalls busily adjusted milling cutters checking blueprints. Norwegians sat at terminals debugging complex program code. And around them stood Soviet engineers and KGB officers in civilian clothes carefully watching every movement, learning and adopting experience. Foreign specialists were perfectly aware of what they were doing. They understood that they were violating the laws of their countries and undermining NATO defense capability. But high fees paid in cash in hard currency and signed non-disclosure documents forced them to remain silent. For several months in 83 and 84 work was boiling in the heart of the Soviet military-industrial complex that would make the Soviet fleet deadly dangerous. When the Toshiba machines were finally launched, Soviet shipbuilders watched the process with awe as if watching a religious ritual. A giant milling cutter controlled by a Kongsberg computer began its dance over a massive bronze billet. Metal shavings flew in all directions. The machine worked with surgical precision, removing microns of metal where rough files used to work. For the first time in the history of the USSR, propellers were not cast but machined from a solid piece of metal. The machines allowed creating blades of a complex saber-like shape, the so-called skewed propellers. Their edges were curved back, resembling a Turkish scimitar. This clever geometry allowed the propeller to cut into the water smoothly, gradually, without sharp pressure drops. This practically eliminated the occurrence of cavitation at operational patrol speeds. From under the cutter of the Japanese machine came products that looked like works of art made of polished bronze. These propellers were masterpieces of hydrodynamics which Soviet engineers had previously seen only in pictures in secret intelligence reports stolen in the West. The result of this technological breakthrough was the commissioning of the nuclear submarine K-284 Akula. It was the lead ship of Project 971 SOSUS. In NATO classification, this class received the respectful and formidable name Akula. It was a ship of a new generation built taking into account all the bitter lessons and mistakes of the past. But its main secret, its soul, were the new 7-bladed propellers made on Toshiba machines. When K-284 was launched and went for state sea trials in the White Sea ranges, Soviet sonar operators monitoring it from support ships did not believe their ears. The boat was going at a speed of 12 knots. At this speed, old nuclear-powered vessels would have rattled like tractors on cobblestones. But the SOSUS only rustled quietly, merging with the noise of the waves. The noise level decreased not by percentages. It decreased by times. It was a triumph of Soviet intelligence and engineering. K-284 became the first real black hole in the ocean, the very ghost ship that Admiral Gorshkov had dreamed of for 20 years. In the mid-80s, the new Soviet boat went on its first combat patrol in the North Atlantic. In NAVFAC, bunkers on the coast of the U.S. and Iceland, operators of the American SOSUS system sat habitually in front of screens sipping coffee. They were waiting for the appearance of characteristic black lines on their spectrograms waterfalls. They were waiting for the familiar roar of Soviet turbines and propellers. But the screens remained frighteningly clean. Operators began to get nervous. They checked equipment, ran tests, thinking that bottom hydrophones were out of order or the cable was cut. They turned the sensitivity knobs to the maximum filtered noises. But the ocean was silent. Where, according to intelligence data, the Soviet boat should have been only the natural noise of waves, the crackling of ice and distant cries of marine animals were heard. The American global tracking system, which cost billions of dollars and worked flawlessly for 30 years, ensuring U.S. security, suddenly went blind and deaf. The Soviet submarine passed through the most guarded Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom gap in the world, unnoticed, like a ghost dissolved in icy water. When the facts were confirmed, a quiet but all-encompassing panic began in the Pentagon. American admirals realized that their strategic advantage, which seemed unshakable, had evaporated overnight. This phenomenon received the official name the problem of 1986 in secret U.S. Navy documents. Naval intelligence analysts understood that the USSR had made an incredible, impossible technological leap. The Russians had jumped over a whole generation of hydroacoustic development. If previously Americans could track Soviet boats from a distance of hundreds of miles, controlling entire ocean basins, now the distance of guaranteed detection had shrunk to a dangerous few kilometers. This changed the entire tactics of naval warfare. Carrier strike groups were no longer safe. Ocean convoys with reinforcements for Europe were under mortal threat. The American fleet, accustomed to being the undivided master of the situation, suddenly felt vulnerable. The question, how did they do it? Where did they get the technology? Hung in the air of the Pentagon corridors like a heavy sword of Damocles. At the same time, in closed wiretap-proof offices at the Lubyanka and in the Kremlin reigned an atmosphere of grim but deep triumph. Operation Toshiba became perhaps the most cost-effective and efficient scam in the entire history of espionage. The cynical arithmetic of the Cold War looked stunning. Spending a paltry $17 million on bribes and smuggling machines, the Soviet Union effectively turned the American SOSUS system, into which the Pentagon had invested $16 billion and 30 years of painstaking work, into a pile of useless underwater scrap metal. Soviet admirals who had lived for years in sticky, humiliating fear of the transparent ocean breathed freely for the first time in a decade. Their strategic missile carriers again became invisible ghosts capable of delivering a retaliatory strike from nowhere. Nuclear parity was restored. At this moment, Moscow enjoyed the sweet illusion of final victory. They did not yet suspect that this success would be Pyrrhic. They did not know that the coming political scandal, when the secret was revealed, would hit the USSR economy with the devastating force of sanctions. But right now, in the icy darkness of the North Atlantic, the newest Shchuka glided in the depths absolutely silently. And great America, for the first time in half a century, was powerless to hear it. Moscow, 1986. In the closed reports of Gosplan of the USSR, lying on the tables of the highest party leadership, the technical triumph of Operation Toshiba looked frighteningly ambivalent. Yes, Soviet intelligence and industry had achieved the impossible. The new nuclear submarines Project 971 Shchuka B, equipped with perfectly turned saber-like propellers, had indeed become masterpieces of engineering thought. They were fast, deadly, and most importantly quiet. But the price of this silence turned out to be astronomical. Each such submarine cost the state budget a sum equivalent to the construction of a small city with all infrastructure. The use of unique titanium alloys, complex electronics, labor-intensive processing of propellers on C machines, all this turned each ship into literally a golden fish. The Soviet economy, already undermined by the catastrophic fall in world oil prices and a chronic shortage of essential goods, was bursting at the seams. It was simply not capable of sustaining the serial production of these underwater leviathans on the scale demanded by the Admirals. Instead of hundreds of boats needed to maintain parity with the USA, the shipyards of Syeverodvinsk and Komsomolsk-on-Amur, with great difficulty missing all deadlines, delivered single units. The victory over noise became a classic Pyrrhic victory. The Soviet Union had created the perfect weapon which it physically could not afford. In the silence of the offices of the Ministry of Defense, and Gosplan officials realized with horror the monstrous, insurmountable disproportion in expenses imposed by the United States. The Americans spent about $16 billion over 40 years on the deployment and operation of their global SOSUS system. It was an impressive amount, but for the world's first economy, it was a quite manageable investment spread over time. The Soviet Union, trying to overcome this acoustic barrier, was forced to completely rebuild its shipbuilding industry, fundamental science, and coastal infrastructure. In terms of real costs, this cost hundreds of billions of rubles. It was a war of attrition in its purest form. $1 invested by the Pentagon in a passive hydrophone on the ocean floor forced the Kremlin to spend 1,000 rubles on complex countermeasures. Washington brilliantly implemented a strategy of economic strangulation of the enemy without a single shot fired. It forced Moscow to burn its limited resources in the furnace of an insane arms race while the shelves of Soviet stores emptied and social tension grew. Realizing that it was impossible to achieve quantitative parity with new quiet boats and the ocean was still visible or rather audible through and through by old noisy ships, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the USSR made a difficult, painful but forced decision. The doctrine of global presence in the world ocean, which Admiral of the Fleet of the Soviet Union Sergei Gorshkov had cherished and promoted for decades, was sent to the scrap heap. In its place came a strictly defensive passive strategy which received the name Bastion. Strategic missile submarine cruisers no longer tried to break through to the shores of the U.S.A. through the tightly guarded Greenland-Iceland United Kingdom gap. The risk of detection and destruction was too great. Instead, they were recalled. Formidable nuclear-powered vessels created for ocean expanses returned to the coastal zones of the Soviet Union into the cold Barents Sea and the closed Sea of Okhotsk. The ocean fleet, the pride of the nation created to project power anywhere in the globe, was effectively locked in its own territorial waters. From bold attack, the USSR moved to def passive defense. New patrol areas for the bastions were not chosen by chance. Soviet strategists, deprived of technological advantage, bet on natural shelters beyond the control of American electronics. The bastions were located under the age-old ice of the Arctic. Here, under the multi-meter ice shell, reigned constant deafening acoustic chaos. Giant hummocks rubbed against each other, ice fields cracked and broke under the pressure of currents. This monstrous background noise created a natural curtain that blinded sensitive SOSUS sensors and confused the sonars of enemy hunter submarines. Soviet missile carriers learned new dangerous maneuvers. They learned to surface, breaking the ice with their strong hull to launch missiles from a Polinia. The Arctic became the last safe haven for the nuclear shield of the USSR. It was a harsh, inhospitable place where crews fought not only with the likely adversary but also with ruthless nature, hoping that the ice roof would save them from the all-seeing eye of America. For Soviet admirals raised on ideas of ocean power, the transition to the bastion tactics became a personal and professional tragedy. For decades, they had built a blue water navy, a fleet of the open ocean capable of challenging NATO on equal terms in the Atlantic and the Pacific. Now these imperial ambitions had shrunk to the size of a brown water navy, a coastal defense fleet. Mighty nuclear-powered vessels capable of circumnavigating the globe underwater in autonomous navigation were forced to circle gloomily in limited squares off their shores, guarded by surface ships and aviation from land like children in a sandbox under the supervision of adults. It looked like a humiliating public admission that the open ocean belonged to the United States. The psychological effect of this strategic retreat demoralized the officer corps. Commanders who dreamed of being wolves in the vastness of the universe felt like watchdogs tied to a short chain near a kennel. Even under the conditions of the USSR retreat into protected bastions, the United States did not stop. Realizing that the stationary SOSUS system was losing its effectiveness against new quiet boats and physically did not reach remote areas of the Arctic, the Pentagon brought new technologies into the game. Ships of the SURTAS system entered the scene. These were special vessels looking like civilian tugs which pulled kilometer-long flexible hydrophone antennas behind them on long cables. Unlike fixed cables of SOSUS chained to the bottom, these ships were mobile. They could go right to the borders of the Soviet bastions, to the edge of the ice, and listen. In addition, the U.S. Navy began to introduce powerful computers for digital signal processing. These electronic brains were able to isolate even the weakest, barely noticeable man-made noises from the chaos of ice grinding. The arms race did not stop for a minute. It simply moved to a new, even more complex and expensive technological level. This level demanded even greater costs for countermeasures from the USSR, costs that the dying Soviet economy simply no longer had. While round-the-clock work on super-expensive titanium hulls and complex propellers boiled on the closed slipways of Syeverodvinsk, the rest of the country was rapidly plunging into the abyss of total deficit. The mid and late 80s in the USSR were a time of humiliating coupons for sugar and soap, endless lines for frozen chicken and soy sausage, empty, echoing store shelves. The contrast between the high-tech, sparkling titanium submarine fleet and the poverty of the civilian sector became glaring, unbearable. The Soviet Union spent the last critically important resources to make its boats quiet, while the people began to grumble dully from hopelessness and fatigue. The arms race, spurred by paranoid fear of the SOSUS system, sucked all the juices out of the economy like a vampire. Every propeller perfectly turned on a Japanese Toshiba machine was paid for not only with currency. It was paid for by a decline in the standard of living of millions of Soviet citizens, by unfinished hospitals and schools. This inexorably approached the social explosion that would soon sweep away the empire. The finale of this grandiose technological drama came not in a stormy sea but in the snow-covered Kremlin. In December 1991, the red flag with the hammer and sickle slowly, to the creak of the mechanism, crawled down the flagpole over the Senate Palace. The Soviet Union, a superpower possessing the most powerful submarine fleet in the world by the number of pennants, officially ceased to exist. The empire collapsed not from a nuclear strike, which the admirals in the bunkers feared so much. It did not fall from the invasion of NATO tank armadas. It simply tore itself apart under the unbearable weight of its own armor. The giant military machine created to confront the whole world turned out to be absolutely useless against internal economic collapse. The newest Shchukabi boats and giant Akulas, the pride of the fleet, remained standing at the piers, rusting without fuel and spare parts. Many of them would soon be ruthlessly sawed into scrap metal with money from the American Nunlugar program designed to disarm the former enemy. It was a finale full of bitter historical irony. The USSR bought silence in the ocean but paid for it with its own life. Despite the collapse of the great country and the geopolitical storms of the 90s, the material witnesses of Operation Toshiba did not disappear anywhere. The famous Japanese machines MBP 110, which caused a grandiose international scandal, still stand in the workshops of the Baltic shipyard and other defense enterprises of Russia. These iron monsters, assembled in the early 80s, continue to work. They turn parts for modern Russian submarines, already of new projects. They have turned into peculiar monuments of a bygone era, silent metal witnesses that technologies can be more important than any ideology. Japanese quality turned out to be so high that the equipment survived the Soviet Union and the Cold War and the numerous economic crises of the new Russia. They remain a grim reminder of how one successful, albeit illegal, deal can change the fate of a fleet for decades to come. With the end of the Cold War, the need for total paranoid eavesdropping on the ocean formally decreased. The threat of global nuclear war receded. Part of the capacity of the SOSUS system was declassified and transferred to civilian scientists. Now the same ultrasensitive hydrophones that anxiously searched for the noise of Captain Viktor Lyubimov's propellers in the 70s are used by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration of the U.S. for peaceful purposes. They listen to the low-frequency songs of blue whales trying to unravel their language. They track the migration routes of marine giants. They record underwater volcanic eruptions warning of tsunamis. The doomsday weapon turned into the planet's stethoscope. But military posts are not closed completely. They just went into sleep mode, continuing to monitor the depths with the corner of their ear. After all, geopolitics, like the ocean, is never completely calm, and old enemies can return in a new guise. The history of the confrontation between the SOSUS system and the Soviet fleet rewrites textbooks of military strategy. It clearly proves that in the modern world information has become a more deadly weapon than N.T. or uranium. The Soviet Union lost not because it had bad missiles or cowardly sailors. Its sailors were heroes ready to die, and missiles could destroy the world several times. It lost because the enemy possessed absolute information superiority. Knowing where the enemy is every second of time makes any of his armor, any of his power useless. The SOSUS system showed that the war of the future is not the clanking of tracks and the roar of artillery cannonade. It is a quiet, invisible war of data sensors and computer algorithms. He who owns information owns the battlefield even before the first shot is fired. The final chord of this story brings us back to the image of a lone submarine in the boundless ocean. The story of Captain Viktor Lyubimov, his crew, and thousands of other submariners remains an eternal warning. Technologies change at breakneck speed. Powerful processors replace radio tubes and autonomous underwater drones replace cables. But the essence of underwater warfare remains unchanged. It is a game of nerves in total darkness. And while another ambitious captain thinks that he is an invisible hunter creeping in the abyss somewhere thousands of miles away from him, in a quiet, cozy, air-conditioned office, someone already sees him on a monitor screen and listens to the rhythm of his heart through headphones. The ocean knows how to keep secrets only if you know how to be silent. But in the era of digital transparency, silence becomes an impossible art. The loudest sound in the world is not the explosion of a torpedo. It is the sound of your mistake amplified by an enemy hydrophone.